The date is January 27, 1981. Israel Friedman, Friedman, talks about what he found in the Buchenwald concentration camp shortly after liberation. The camp was liberated approximately April 11, 1945, and the 120 evacuation hospital, of which Mr. Friedman was a laboratory technician, came into the area and was the first official United States contact with the survivors. Could you tell us briefly what you found when you came into the camp?
Well, first off, I wasn't the first one to go. Our outfit was the first officially assigned unit. Secondly, the camp was not liberated by anyone from the outside. The liberation occurred by the prisoners themselves. They had had a radio and were aware of the approach of the American troops just as much as the Germans were. And as the Germans were preparing to flee, the prisoners who were on very well, because the camp was one that repaired pistols, revolvers, rifles, and also binoculars. So the prisoners were able to have a considerable amount of firearms. And when they heard that the Americans were approaching, and they saw the Germans frantically getting ready to leave, they almost liberated themselves. Germans left, many of them were captured, many of them were put into what had been the solitary confinement for many of the prisoners. And when we arrived, about 3 days after they had liberated themselves, the self-appointed scouts among the prisoners were out in the woods looking for the stormtroopers. Many were found and brought in. Some were found and never brought in. Some were, well, we don't know what happened. We can always imagine what happened. We met as we went toward the camp, and remember I had told you we had opened our base at the bottom of the hill. Buchenwald was up on a hill, and we were spread out at the bottom. We had not officially opened the hospital. We had merely opened the tents for sleeping. Among the first of the contacts were there was a Frenchman and a Czech, both of whom had been at Buchenwald for a considerable time, and both of them were Spanish veterans. And they were fighters, and they were out with a crew looking for the Nazis.
You mean veterans of the Spanish Civil War?
That's right.
Yeah.
They had been captured when the Germans moved into Czechoslovakia, the Germans moved into France, and they had been transported to Buchenwald. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that Buchenwald was not a Jewish camp at first. It was a political camp. It may have been the first political camp that was established. And to this camp were sent the intellectuals, the political opponents, the enemies, but not Jews. So they had a high percentage of people experienced in organization. And they organized the prisoners of the camp. Among the things that we found out is that they had classes in all languages, they had classes in mathematics, they had classes in it was run almost like a small college. They felt that the way to survive was to keep yourself active, keep your mind going in the direction that it had always gone. If you were an intellectual, you needed intellectual pursuits. If you were politically an organized person, then you had to have that kind of activity. Otherwise, you would just stagnate and you would die out. And they knew that. So they were well organized. It was only in the last stages, maybe the last year, as the Russians began driving the Germans westward, that the Jews were pulled out of camps like Dachau and Auschwitz and many others that I don't know about, and they were pushed further west. So they would be traveling from one camp to another. And when they arrived at Buchenwald, they were exhausted, and they were among the first who were being cremated. Not quite sure how much cremation had been going on before the arrival of Jews. I just don't remember.
They did have a crematory in
they had a
Buchenwald.
crematory there, and it was used, and we saw the ashes, of course, and we saw the remains of bodies in the ovens, and we saw the collection of bones and the relics and pieces of teeth and stuff like that. We saw that, and they were very well organized because each one was piled in a separate place. Bones were in one place, ashes were in another place, teeth were in another. Everything was organized like Germans are always methodically organized. Very clear cut. And bodies had been piled up.
You saw lampshades made of human skin?
We saw lampshades, and some of our less sensitive people even took some of them home. Everybody was moved by it, and I guess they took it home to prove that it had existed. I couldn't touch it, but I did see it, and some of my good friends took it home, and they explained it. How else can we prove that it existed? So they were there. I don't know if I told you that of our first experience. I started saying, maybe I ought to go back a little bit. Some of it might belong elsewhere, but we can start it here. We were moving pretty fast at the beginning of April, the end of March.
You were with Patton's Army?
We were with the Third Army. We had been moving from Third Army, Fifth Army, Seventh Army. We were with everybody. Nobody seemed to know what to do with us. We were a well-equipped evacuation hospital with a crackerjack crew of people. Both our doctors were good, and staff was good. It might be interesting for you to know that a good percentage of our outfit was Jewish and from the New York area. They had been in the Army's AST program, the one that they sent young people to college to learn specifics. And some of these people had been to hospitals learning to be medics. And they suddenly disbanded that AST program, and they didn't know what to do with these youngsters. And we needed them, so they came to us. And not only were they bright young people, but they were trained and very highly motivated. So that we were good. We knew we were good, and we were good. The only thing is we had nothing to do. We were never set up to receive wounded, and we kept chasing Patton and never stopped. Until finally we came to Weimar, and only vaguely did we know that there was a concentration camp there. Buchenwald was, maybe we knew Buchenwald as a name, I don't remember now. But we certainly didn't know it was at Weimar. So we pulled through the town And our first observation was a horrendous smell, something that none of us had ever experienced, and we couldn't identify it. There was a sweetness, there was a kind of a perfume. And if we asked what the smell was, people thought maybe it came from a factory, but we could get no answer. We drove through Weimar to the base of a hill and set up our tents for sleeping. It was a routine kind of thing. We still didn't know what we were going to be doing. We went to sleep that night. We arrived late.
Do you know the date or around when?
Maybe the second week
In April?
In April. I think it was April 11th, 10th, something like that. We got up early as usual, and it was a foggy morning. And off a little ways, maybe 50 yards away, we saw some drifting figures, thin, wearing a striped kind of clothing that we had never seen before. And it almost looked like they were floating through. There was no purpose in their gait. It was just a drifting kind of thing. And then we suddenly realized that these must have been prisoners, and we brought a few of them in. And those of us who were able to speak Yiddish spoke to them and learned that indeed they had come from the camp, which we were told was up at the top of the hill. Well, our first reaction was to bring him in. I think it was a Sunday, and pancakes was the menu for breakfast. Maybe the reason I think it's Sunday is because we always have pancakes for Sunday. It might have been any other day. And we wanted to feed them, and they refused. We thought it was politeness, and we insisted, and I guess out of politeness they acceded, and they began eating pancakes. And then we noticed that after a few bites they would leave. We thought maybe they had done their polite duty, but then we found them outside the tent throwing up. And it suddenly struck us that these emaciated people just couldn't eat this kind of food so quickly. And it was a horrible feeling to think that you had also tortured somebody who had been tortured. At any rate, later that day, we were told that we were going up to the camp to do an evaluation and to set up a medical program there. That was our first experience. Here we were, a bunch of New Yorkers. Some of us knew about concentration camps. The bulk of our crew was from the Midwest and Southwest. And we walked into a scene that was just something beyond our belief. We couldn't even understand such a thing. We saw, besides the bodies piled up on flat wagons, we saw people walking around, drifting. You can't describe it as walking. It's a kind of a drifting movement that they had. Just through the streets, and occasionally somebody would sink down and just lie there. And if we rushed over to look, we discovered that he was dead. People were dying in front of us. It's hard to believe a thing like that, because beyond our experience, beyond our imagination. So we saw these bodies, and then we walked through the crematoria, and we saw bones and skeletons. And at that time we realized that the smell we had encountered when we were in Weimar was the smell that had permeated this entire area. Nothing was burning anymore. But how do you get rid of a smell that has existed for months and months and had actually penetrated every tree, the ground, the houses? everything in the area smelled of that because this was the atmosphere for so many months. It's like oil seeping into the ground somewhere. You never really get rid of the smell of the oil. And that's what had happened here. That the smell of burning bodies had permeated everything.
How many crematoria were there?
Well, there was one building. I would guess there must have been maybe 10 ovens. Behind each of the ovens were piles of bones, piles of ashes, and other things that had been collected. Bags of glasses.
Eugene Weinstock, in his book Beyond the Last Path, in which he describes his own experiences as a prisoner at Buchenwald, describes a gallows in the camp and also a wooden post at which Germans themselves were shot by firing squads.
Yeah, there were these things around, and I think that among the pictures that we have in here, there was a gallows that we found there, and an effigy was strung up, and this the prisoners had done to show what it had been like. But there were posts where people were shot, and I imagine that Germans were shot there too, both the guards and the prisoners. It's interesting that within a few days, this place was so organized that within a few days, by the time we arrived, and this was maybe 3 or 4 days after they had liberated themselves, there were painted signs welcoming Americans, French, Russians, Germans. It was incredible that they could have had such an orientation after being in the prison so many years. One of the I was in charge of the laboratory section. And obviously we were not going to set up a laboratory. So I was pretty much on my own for the week that we spent up there. I think it was maybe 6 days. So I wandered around, and because I spoke Yiddish and a little bit of French, I met a lot of people and we could talk. I don't remember all the things we talked, but I do remember being amazed at how aware they were of what was going on the outside. They knew more, I think, of the progress of the war and political activity and even union activity in America. I remember one doctor who asked me how come John L. Lewis had changed so much from his earlier days as a union leader to the days when he declared a strike of the coal miners during a period of war. He was surprised at Lewis's lack of understanding of the war. And he told me of how they had organized themselves, how they indoctrinated new people, how indoctrinated is not the right word, but how they explained their rules, and their philosophy, the need to survive. And the need to survive is basically what all Jews tell each other, as long as you're healthy. And this was their first principle: you got to stay healthy. So they insisted that you be as clean as could be, and they were clean. They insisted that you maintain an active mind. They held their classes. They had underground political groups. They identified their traitors, and they dealt with their traitors. They utilized some of the youngsters who were available to help steal things from the Nazis.
What do you mean by youngsters?
They were young people.
How old?
It's hard to tell how old a child who has been emaciated and not fed is. 13-year-old could look like a 7-year-old. I would guess from their responses that the kids we came in contact with were about 13, 14, even though they looked more like 8 or 9. But very alert. They had experienced stuff. Many of them, well, we've read the stories about kids who we utilized to help burn piles of bodies, and in pouring of the kerosene they discovered relatives and parents even. And they had to learn to survive a thing like that.
Now, Buchenwald was essentially a slave labor camp, wasn't it? From what I understand, they even had satellite camps attached to Buchenwald where they sent prisoners out to do specific jobs.
That's probably true. I'm not sure I remember. I do know about the factories that they had there, the factories for the repair of weapons, factories for the repair of binoculars. It's hard for me to decide whether I remember the satellite camps or whether I have read about the satellite camps so that I think that I'm not quite sure of that.
It's of no great consequence at this time. That could be verified easily enough.
Yeah. Now the prisoners had a hospital of their own. They treated their own prisoners. The Germans had their hospital and their doctors, and they treated them. The prisoners had their own hospital. Certainly it was nothing like the ones the Germans had. But they treated their own. How much help they got from the German doctors, I'm not sure I remember. But our function when we went in there, since we were not going to utilize the German doctors, was to help those doctors that worked with the prisoners continue their work and give them what we could. It's a sad commentary that our guys held demonstrations for the German doctors of the wonders of penicillin at that time. And the German doctors there, the doctors in the camp, were elated over it and marveled at how effective this would be, until we told them that we could not give them any of that because by Army regulation, the stuff which was relatively scarce could only be used on American wounded. And we had no American wounded, and our penicillin couldn't be used. I'm sure that surreptitiously our guys left penicillin with them, because I know this is what we did with the whole blood that used to come to us earlier. There was a blood truck that came through periodically, and they would ask how much blood we needed for American wounded. Well, we would tell them we had no American wounded. We had some other ill people, because we had picked up some even German prisoners, German ill people. They wouldn't leave the blood. They were prohibited from using the blood on anyone but Americans. And it made our doctors furious, especially when they learned that the blood was going to be dumped because of the expiration date. So we learned after a while that when they asked how many sick people you had, we would say, how much blood do you have? And when they told us how much blood, we would say, well, that's about what we need for our American wounded. And the truck drivers, they too knew that this was not quite true, but it made it possible for them to leave the blood. So I think by this time we were wise enough to leave the penicillin behind without saying anything. We committed a lot of mistakes. We fed the lager people a little too quickly. and a little too richly, so that from starvation we passed them on into stages of diarrhea, maybe even dysentery, until we learned that you can't do it that way, yet you have to gradually bring people back to normalcy. It was an incredible thing to see that when you gave a blood transfusion, you could see the blood running into the transparent veins. People were that thin. We learned that when we moved them away from their wooden shell barracks, they slept on in wooden shells, and we moved them into the Nazi buildings where they had stone floors, that stone was harder on the bones of emaciated people than wood, and we were asked by the people themselves, please to move them back unless we can give them beds. And here too we could not give them our hospital beds because it was prohibited. It was to be used only on American wounded. We tried to get around that. We went to the Nazi medical dumps and picked up old litters and things and brought them back and tried to use that. But we had to be educated on what concentration life was and what cruelty can do to people. We didn't know. We just knew standard medicine. That if somebody was sick, you fed him. If someone needed a transfusion, you gave him. It didn't work that way. It took a long time for people to come back to being able to receive normal medical attention.
People were dying every day in the interim?
Oh, yeah.
About how many were there in the camp at the time? Do you have any idea?
No, I don't. I think we said that a monument was set up that showed something like, I don't remember how many were killed there. Like
Well,
51,000 were executed there.
Weinstock said that the maximum that they had there was about 80,000.
Yeah, it was not a very large camp.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure places like Auschwitz and Dachau and Treblinka were much larger. Different purpose.
Yeah.
They were designed to destroy people, and Buchenwald originally was not designed to destroy people, but to contain them.
Yeah. Yeah, you were talking about medical care, that they were treating themselves, they had their own hospitals, and did you notice a slow process of recuperation among them?
We weren't there long enough really to make that kind of an observation, but there was a change. I'm sure people were not dying from sheer exhaustion the way they were when we arrived. Once we had moved the people into the Nazi barracks, and we had them living on several floors, people were still dying, and each morning there would be a collection of bodies at the foot of the stairs, people who died during the night. And this was lessened. It was also not unusual to see that someone would pick himself up out of the pile of bodies. He wasn't really dead, although he had been collected, and walk away. It was also not unusual to see some of the walking prisoners looking at a dead body in the street and exchanging clothes or bits of clothes with them. What the dead one had that was better than what the live one had was exchanged. In the camp, people congregated by nationality. The French were together mostly, the Czechs stayed together mostly. And we don't, although they mixed, there was this kind of compactness. We noticed at one point that there was one group that was totally isolated by the prisoners themselves, and when I asked who they were, I was told that they were Hungarians. That they were Hungarians who would voluntarily come to Hitler, to Hitler's forces, offering payment for their lives. They offered it in terms of jewelry, money, things like that. And of course the money and jewelry was taken, and then they were taken too and sent to camp. And because they had done this voluntarily, the rest of the camp, which had been highly integrated, excluded this group. These were the ones who could not fit in. If you came voluntarily, you could not join.
How do they find out?
I couldn't say how they found out, but they knew.
Mm-hmm.
They were so alert. They were so alert.
These Hungarians, were they Jews or were they
Jews.
mixed?
Oh yeah, no, they were
They were
Jews.
Jews.
They were Jews. And this was the point that was critical for them.
Did this lead to an increase in anti-Semitism or a beginning of anti-Semitic feelings among the prisoners?
I don't think there was any anti-Semitism. Certainly I couldn't detect it. I think those who were politically aware would not be anti-Semitic.
But you had Ukrainians there, you had Poles there, who are by nature anti-Semitic almost.
Almost. There might have been some, but I could not detect it.
Uh-huh. Were there any acts of retribution?
Towards Germans?
Towards Germans, towards other prisoners, towards the Nazis?
Toward prisoners, I couldn't say. Prisoner toward prisoner, except for this bit about the Hungarians.
Well, you said before that the traitors among them were dealt with.
Yeah. Well, there could have been a lot of other people that should have been dealt with who weren't particularly traitors. There may have been people who hoarded things or people who refused to live up to the rules and regulations. I don't think they would have been dealt with the same way that traitors were dealt with. We did see in the isolation cells, which were really prison cells, that stormtroopers had been captured and been put in there. And in the first day that we arrived, units of infantry that were being passed through the camp on their way further east were so incensed by what they saw and so angry that the cell doors were open and many of these troops would go in and just beat the hell out of the stormtroopers. So when we came in and looked, some of them were bloodied, some of them were beaten, some of them were just lying there. But this was done not by, a lot of this could have been done earlier by the inmates of the camp. But this kind of thing we saw done by American soldiers. Their anger was understandable. You can't expose people to what they saw for the first time in their lives and not expect them to get angry.
Well, the prisoners themselves, the liberated prisoners themselves, were hardly strong enough physically to inflict much
Some of them
physical
were.
damage.
Some of them were. The ones I encountered, not everybody in that camp was emaciated. My feeling is that the emaciated ones, and again, memory after 40 years or so, 35 years is a little vague. Not all of them were emaciated. Certainly the ones out hunting the Nazis were physically strong. How they maintained themselves that way, I don't know. Maybe it was good mental approach. I don't think they got any more food than anybody else. Perhaps they were able to get more food. I think the emaciated ones we saw were mostly the Jews who had been driven for hundreds of miles
Those that came from the other camps.
Those who came from the different camps. Somewhere I seem to remember that we were told there were no Jews at Buchenwald except for political Jews. That the extermination Jews were brought in from elsewhere.
You said some time ago that you had visitors, prominent visitors who came to the camps, came to Buchenwald. Did you see any of them, or did you just hear about them?
Well, the Vice President Barclay came there while we were there. Saw him in passing, that's all, and he was shown around the camp. Subsequently, we heard that when he returned to Paris at a dinner of some kind, he told about having been to Buchenwald and said that he thought that a good deal of what he was shown had been arranged by the army for its effect. He thought the bodies piled up had been done by the army to impress him. It's incredible that he could have said such a thing, but then again, who could believe that anybody would be so methodical as to arrange bodies in like logs on a truck? He couldn't accept it any more than we could accept it, because I remember at the end of that first day, when we walked down from the hill again to our base, we couldn't believe what we had seen. It was almost like a bad dream, except that who can dream things like that? Because even a dream isn't that horrendous. I remember that we were talking about it, and actually it seemed almost we were saying, did we really see that? Or were we brainwashed into it? Although we didn't use the word brainwash, it didn't exist then. How could this have been possible, was the attitude that we had. And it wasn't until we had been there several days that the reality sank in. At any rate, what we did there for the 6 days was arrange a medical program. We still had not been given instructions as to what we were going to do. All we knew was go up there, see what you can do. And because we had a marvelous bunch of doctors and everybody else, we actually used all the facilities that were available there and acted as if we were going to set up a hospital for ourselves. And then word came that we were to move out. So this is basically what we did there. Set up the hospital, give demonstrations of techniques that could be used, techniques that we were trained to use, and then leave. But we left with a new concept. And again, when we left, we didn't know where we were going or what we were going to be doing until we came to our next stop, which turned out to be another place where we set up hospitals for refugees from the concentration camp, except that we stayed here for a much longer period, and we actually set up the hospitals and operated. That was the only time we had ever set up our unit and operated as a medical unit.
Coming back to Buchenwald, we'll get to that I assume was Cham, C-H-A-M.
Yeah.
That was on the Czechoslovak border.
Right.
Yeah, now, let me ask you a few questions. What was the attitude of the surrounding population towards the camp and towards the prisoners? Was there any indication?
Well, at Weimar, at Buchenwald, they were bringing in all of the residents of Weimar in shifts. They were coming up by truckloads and brought into a compound where they could see the piles of body and where an army spokesman in German explained what had been found there and asked for the reaction of the populace. To a man, they said they were totally unaware. It's not possible that they were unaware.
Weinstock in his book has one little passage where he says every time the prisoners marched to and from their place of work, they were jeered at and spat at by the local populace. So how could they possibly not have known? You didn't believe that they did not know.
No, we couldn't believe it. First of all, the smell that permeated Weimar, which we knew, we experienced rather, they must have known came from Buchenwald. Secondly, the railroad cars that brought the prisoners in came to Weimar and not to Buchenwald, came to Weimar where they were taken out, put into trucks, and driven through town up the hill. So they had to know. It was just not possible that they could not know. The other business, Weinstock certainly lived through it and knew things that I couldn't possibly have experienced or heard about in a few days. Or if I did, I don't remember it. It's so far away. I remember that when I went through Weinstock's book, it seemed closest to my impressions of Buchenwald, what I had seen, what I had heard, what I had been told, than anything else I've read about Buchenwald.
Was there any act of retribution against the populace on the part of the prisoners?
Not that I could see. Not that I could see.
Any acts of retribution against the Germans who had some kind of role in the camps, in the camp?
Only what I told you about, the stormtroopers who were beaten.
How about the...
And what was hinted at by the two people that I had met originally. If they found the stormtrooper or any of the Nazis who had been the guards, it didn't take much for them to consider that the soldiers were trying to escape.
Mm-hmm. Herman Pister, P-I-S-T-E-R, was listed as the commandant of the camp. Do you know what happened to him?
No, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely don't.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure if I ever knew.
Mm-hmm. What about the Ukrainians? Were they part of the guard system there? Or were they prisoners?
I think they were prisoners there.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think they were prisoners there. I'm not sure. I don't think that they were used as guards there. Certainly the nature of the camp as it was originally constructed would not have made the use of Ukrainians appropriate. Because they were not going to use too much brutality against the original political prisoners. If you wanted to use the anti-Semitic Ukrainians, they would be used further east, in other camps like Auschwitz and Dachau. I just don't know for sure. My impression was not that and I certainly did not hear that any Ukrainians were used.
What about the housekeeping facilities? There were upwards of 80,000. Let's say there were even 50,000 prisoners. Were there toilet facilities for them?
Toilet facilities were similar to what the army used. Holes in the ground, slit trenches. There may have been some bathing facilities. I don't remember. I do remember seeing the holes in the ground that were used for toilets. They would just put a board across, and they were certainly not private.
This was even in the winter time.
Since it was the only thing around, I would guess so.
The barracks themselves, what were they like?
The barracks, I guess the closest you could say was that they were like warehouse buildings, the kind that you see used for tobacco, or a barn, except that they would have shelves, similar to what you see in a warehouse where goods are stored on 3 levels. And each of the levels were crowded, so prisoners slept body to body. There was no separation.
Were there any stoves there, or any kind of anything to keep warm? Were the buildings constructed? Were they well constructed to keep out the rain, for instance? Or
I think
snow?
they were well constructed. Yeah, and I think they kept out rain, and I would guess that there was heat. I'm sure there was heat. How much heat they were actually provided, I don't know. There were heating facilities. The roofs looked good and sturdy. I would guess so, because this is the way the Germans would have constructed it. But in any case, if there had been leakage, because of the philosophy of the prisoners, they would have repaired anything that leaked.
They were able to?
I'm sure they were. I'm sure they were.
Were there women in the camp?
There was a section of the camp, I think, that had women. And again, I don't remember. We didn't visit. I'm a little vague there.
Did you see?
I know that there was a children's area, and I guess maybe the women were there too, because at one time we sent several trucks off to Nuremberg to pick up toys to bring back to the kids. I never got to the women's camp, but I do know some of our doctors did, and I do know that we brought back those things for kids. So there was a camp there. My personal relationship there was not existent.
Weinstock talks about a
Does he
brothel.
say there was a women's camp?
He says there was a brothel there that was available to the Aryan prisoners, not to the German soldiers, not to the guards, and not to the Jewish prisoners, only to the Aryan prisoners. And they even had a complicated system of making an assignation, paying 2 marks, and then being summoned at the appel, and told, well, you report to the brothel at such and such an hour.
He would know.
He would know. Yeah, but you had no personal
No,
knowledge
and
of it.
it wasn't the nature of the kind of questions that I would ask or was interested in.
Did you see any of the children?
No, not at Buchenwald. I saw children there later on.
In Cham?
At Sham, yeah.
That's C-H-A-M?
C-H-A.
Where is Cham?
It's near the border with Czechoslovakia, and the prisoners came from a camp called Flossenburg.
How do you spell that?
Flossenberg.
Yeah.
I think once I located it on a map, I haven't looked recently.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a rather large camp. And I know that we set our hospital up in Sham in 5 different buildings. And there we forced Germans to work in the hospital as maintenance people, somewhere in Bavaria. They worked as hospital cleanup and as nurses. And they did reasonably well. This was near Regensburg. Regensburg was the largest city. It was our base of supplies. I visited there 3 years ago.
Oh.
And the square in Sham that we had used to park our trucks, and the hotels and brothels that we used as our sleeping quarters and as our mess facilities were exactly the same as we had left them, except that they now had parking meters in the center of the square. But it was exactly the same. The town had been built up around it peripherally. It was now a very modern kind of town. This is Sham that I'm talking about. But that center square was exactly the way we had left it, even with the same pharmacy.
I never heard of a concentration camp at Sham.
It wasn't at Sham. Sham was where we set up. Flossenburg, someday I'll look at a map again in Germany.
Where did the prisoners come from?
Flossenburg. It was Flossenburg camp. There was a camp
at
called
Flossenburg?
Yeah.
What kind of camp was it?
An extermination camp.
Extermination camp.
Yeah, pretty sure.
Mostly Jews?
Mostly Jews. I think almost all of our prisoners were Jews. All of our patients were Jews.
Were they different than the prisoners you encountered in Buchenwald? I imagine they were more emaciated.
So. Yeah, I think so. Well, you know, at Buchenwald we had two kinds. We had the emaciated kind and the ones that weren't emaciated.
Yes.
Here, there were a lot of sick people. It wasn't just emaciation. Typhus was something we were running scared of at that time. And some of them had typhus. And I remember, I use that example to this very day, our way of treating them was to use a flit gun filled with DDT and spray them white with DDT. I don't know how many people we killed with that. People who died later on because of our beneficent treatment with DDT. But we thought that was the prevention for typhus. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't kill anybody. But to this day, I remember back in any kind of chemical that's used as a cure-all or as a preventive for something, I would be reluctant to use, because I always think back to DDT, which we used so liberally then, and which is now discovered to have been a poison.
Did you have any problem treating the prisoners, the liberated prisoners in Sham?
Well, most of them were very grateful for the help. We did have some people who emotionally were afraid to accept treatment because their experiences in the Nazi camps had been that anything that you offered them medically was in the nature of experimentation, and they were reluctant to accept. I think I told you the one story about one of our corpsmen who had to give someone some sulfur, and every time he offered the pill, the patient refused to accept it. He just wouldn't take it until he reached in under his white smock and pulled out a gun and held up the gun, and then the prisoner took the patient took the pill. It was a humorous thing, but for us it meant that people had been convinced that anybody who offered them something medically was experimenting on them. But by and large,
the patients,
there was a grateful acceptance of grateful is a bad word to use. A welcome acceptance of the medical care that we were offering.
They recognized the Americans as liberators and friends?
As friends, certainly. And, you know, they even accepted the help from the German staff that we used. And we had to use German staff because we were going to go away.
Yeah.
And ultimately, we didn't even have the kind of trained personnel that we had at Buchenwald to take over.
What was the relation between the Germans and the patients, and vice versa? What was the relation between the Germans and the Americans? What's going on in my mind is to many of the Americans and the Germans, these people were not very, quote, nice looking. They were emaciated, they were dirty, they were demoralized.
Relationship between our people and the patients was just that, a medical person and a patient. The relationship between our guys and the Germans was something different. Our people had been very anti-German at first, after that experience in Buchenwald. But people in Bavaria are very attractive and very friendly. And Bavaria had not been severely affected by the war. There was plenty of food. It's a lovely country. Very handsome people, especially the women. And the first fraternization between our guys and Germans took place there. And the people very earnestly would come up when you talk with them and ask, why were we fighting on opposite sides? We should have been fighting on the same side against the Russians. The Russians they perceived as their enemy. And we were always their friends, even though we had bombed hell out of a good part of Germany. Very, very hard not to be affected by these very, very friendly, handsome people. And our guys were affected by that. Everything was neat, everything was orderly. They were compliant. We said clean up these buildings so that we can bring in prisoners, even Jewish prisoners. They cleaned them up. It was immaculate. We said work with these. It was done. You know, they were. One boss is the same as another boss, apparently.
Did they express any feelings pro or anti-Hitler or Army or SS?
Nothing anti-Hitler. Nothing. This was what was supposed to have been done. This is what they were told to do, and that was correct. Right or wrong, it was correct. There was no anti-Hitler feeling. There was no expression that we were led down the wrong path, except, as I told you, that they were convinced that the enemy was the Soviet Union, and that we should have been fighting with the Germans.
In the intervening years, have you met any of the former prisoners, or have you heard about any of them?
No. No. What I have heard is from some of the people who are my outfit who returned to their very small towns in Midwest, who tried telling people what they saw, and they were very active in spreading the horrors that they saw. But none of the prisoners didn't hear that at all.
You've heard about people like Professor Butts, I think his name is, and others who are trying to rewrite history and are now claiming that this whole business of the Holocaust was a hoax, that it never took place.
Well, this is obvious nonsense. All they have to do is go to any one of these small towns where some of our people now live. Go to those people and say, was it a hoax or did you see it? It's not the interest or the important thing about our experience in Buchenwald is that it came immediately. not something that you visited 6 months later and saw as a memorial. It was immediate, 3 days after. Nothing had been done. It's true some American troops had passed through, but nothing was done there until we came.
You have no idea. Well, while you were there, no one else was helping them except the GIs, is that right?
There were no other troops there, no other soldiers there, no other anybody there but us for the 6 days that we were there.
No
When
UNRWA,
we left,
no UNRWA, no JDC,
Nothing.
no Red
Nothing.
Cross,
nothing.
nobody.
Nobody came. When we left, at that point, I'm sure other people were scheduled to come in, or we wouldn't have left. But no one had been there.
Yeah.
And I think that we were the only ones who were experienced with a concentration camp situation, because it was the westernmost concentration camp.
That was the first one to be liberated.
I think
then.
so. I think that probably was the first concentration camp then. It may be that others were liberated by the Russian soldiers, but coming from our direction, we were probably the first ones.
Did any of the media people come in? Reporters, photographers?
Yeah, we had many reporters. We had a reporter from Time magazine, and we had that photographer. What's her name? Famous photographer.
Oh, the one who had multiple sclerosis?
Yeah, the one who developed the multiple sclerosis.
Yes, yes, yes.
She was there taking pictures, and as a matter of fact, I have a picture of her taking pictures of the Weimar people being lectured by the GIs.
So they themselves saw with their own eyes that this was real. Is there anything you would like to put on the record before we conclude?
It's a long time since then, and there are many things that may come to me later on. Some of it you'll find in that article that I gave you.
That we'll attach to the tape and make it a part of the record.
Yeah, there's a lot more descriptive stuff in there that I just don't remember.
Did the guys...
But subsequently, before we left Europe, we were getting ready to come home. I was interviewed by people from the Nuremberg Commission and asked about our experience, my own personal experiences, because I was so free at the time when we were in Brooklyn.
This is side B of the interview with Israel Friedman. Actually, there is very little to add to what was at the end of side A, except that the name of the photographer is Margaret Bourke White, Bourke -White.